Okay, Matt, I'm going to let you let people in. But other than that, I'd like to welcome everyone to either a history of the Catholic Church to 1540 class or to our first formations and reformations in Catholic thought lunch hour lecture of the term. Just so you know, the talk will be recorded today so that it will be available at a later point. And I'd like to start really by noting that this lecture series is hosted monthly by the Jesuit Center for Catholic Studies, located within St. Paul's College at the University of Manitoba. For those of you who don't already know me, I'm Dr. Meredith Bacola, an assistant professor in the Jesuit Center and professor to the history students who are here today. My colleagues and I remain grateful to the college and especially our indomitable marketing and communications officer, Matt Semchishin, for all his assistance. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that though we are on a virtual platform, both my home and the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. My colleagues and I respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. It's also my pleasure today to welcome our speaker. Professor John Osborne is an honorary research fellow at both the Courtauld Institute in London, the British School at Rome, and as he told me today, the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto. In addition to being a distinguished research professor and Dean Emeritus of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences on this side of the Atlantic at Carleton University in Ottawa. From his earliest publications on the fragmentary mural paintings of Rome's excavated churches of Santa Maria Antiqua and San Clemente, Professor Osborne has honed what it is to be a medievalist and a cultural historian by considering buildings and decorations as sources for the interests and attitudes of those who invested in their construction. To paraphrase from his recent Rome in the 8th century, artifact can be a historical document, not merely to supplement other written sources, but rather to speak in its own voice. Dr. Osborne has published broadly on many such voices, and his most recent book just won the Canadian Society of Medievalists LaBarge Prize for 2020, and I understand that this will be a first in a series. Today, he will introduce us to another decorative program and its potential as a historical document in his talk on Pope John VIII and the Byzantine Connection, evidence from the Church of Santa Maria de Secundicerio in Rome. Take it away, John.
Okay, thank you very much, Meredith, for the very generous introduction. I think I'm going to share my screen right away. That's probably the best thing to do. And you can tell me if that works. Good, thank you. Well, as Meredith has mentioned, my research projects are intended to bring the evidence of material culture. I got to find the arrow for the slides. Okay, there we go. There we go. Are intended to bring the evidence of material culture to bear on much larger historical issues, using buildings and especially their decorations as documents for historical study. And in my recent book that was mentioned, I argued that even after the political break between Rome and Constantinople in the mid-8th century, and after the forging of a new alliance between the popes and the Franks, and Charlemagne in particular, the city of Rome remained very much Mediterranean in terms of its culture and its cultural outlook. And what I'd like to do today is to attempt to extend that view, that thinking, into the later years, not of the 8th century, but the 9th century, which is the project I'm working on at the moment. Now, I think if one was asked to say something about what was going on in Rome in the late 800s, the late 9th century, most historians would probably draw a blank. It's not an area that much is known about. There are some written records, to be sure, but not many. And the last third of the 9th century is perhaps the most barren of the entire Middle Ages in this regard, because our main written source for the history of the papacy, what's called the Liber Pontificalis, the papal book, which is a series of serial biographies of the popes, it breaks off at the death of Pope Hadrian II in the year 872. And after that, we have only the fragmentary biography of Pope Stephen V, 885 to 891, and then nothing until a much later period. So significantly, there is no biography for the enormously important Pope John VIII, whose dates are 872 to 882. And he is the focus of my talk today. And his reign as Pope witnessed a series of tumultuous moments, culminating, in fact, in his murder in 882. Complicating matters, this is also the moment when the Carolingian dynasty of rulers comes to an end. And with it comes to an end what I'll call the security umbrella that had sheltered Rome and central Italy from attacks from Muslim North Africa, attacks by the Saraceni, the Saracens, as they were called in contemporary documents. Rome had already had one taste of what would come in the famous attack on the city in the year 846, when the Church of St. Peter's, which was situated outside the protection of the city's Aurelian walls, had been captured and thoroughly looted, leading to the subsequent construction of a protective enclosure, the so-called Leonine city, undertaken by Pope Leo IV. But by the mid-870s, all of central Italy was being subject to incursions, such that the principal monasteries of Monte Cassino, Farfa, San Vincenzo al Volturno, these were all overrun, their monks slaughtered, their buildings abandoned in the 880s until security once again prevailed, but that wouldn't happen until the second decade of the 10th century. I'll come back a bit later to the flight from Rome of the so-called Formosan political party during the night between Easter Saturday and Easter Sunday of the year 876. But it is significant that in writing to the Frankish court to lodge a complaint and to request the return of the fugitives who had fled to the north, John VIII pointed out that this action on their part had left the city of Rome in great peril, because in leaving through the Porta San Pancrazio, the fugitives had left the gate unlocked, and the Saraceni lurking outside could easily have gained entry had they wished. Now, for the reign of John VIII, we do have some written documentation, mostly chronicles written north of the Alps. That's, for example, how we know that he was murdered in 882. And we have some specimens of his correspondence, but they're all preserved elsewhere, and some of them have questions about authenticity. What we don't have is any document from Rome itself, any written document. And it's in these situations that material culture becomes so very important. So what I want to do today is try to demonstrate that we can learn quite a bit about the overall culture in Rome in the 870s, in the time of John VIII, from the decorations painted on the walls of a church of that era, the building that you're looking at here. I'm sure many of you are saying, just a minute, that building doesn't look at all like a church. And in fact, it wasn't built as a church. It was built, of course, as it appears, as a Roman temple. It was actually rebuilt in the form that you see it here in about the year 75 BCE. And it's situated just adjacent to the Tiber River. If you look at the view in the upper left, the Tiber is just in the back where those trees are. And like many temple buildings constructed in the days of ancient Rome, the Pantheon is probably the best example. It was simply too good a structure to waste. So the ancient Romans built with amazing skill. They built buildings to last millennia, and they have. And in the Middle Ages, these buildings were no longer being used as temples, of course, but they were too good to waste. And so in the Middle Ages, almost all of them were, shall we say, repurposed as Christian churches, and that's the case of the Pantheon as well. Now, over the centuries, this one became encased in a cluster of later accretions, to the point that the original structure was almost entirely hidden from view. And if you look at the 18th century Piranesi print in the lower right, you can see how various buildings have been built up against it. And at one point, there were windows inserted into the walls and a door into the non-entrance end and so on. So it's been messed about quite a lot over the years. All of that, all of those accretions, all of those subsequent changes were either taken away, in the case of accretions, or restored in the years between 1921 and 1925, so just exactly a century ago, by architect restorer by the name of Antonio Munoz, and that leaves behind the aspect that we see today. So it now looks again like a Roman temple. And that campaign exactly 100 years ago was not without very strong political overtones. You have to think about what's going on in Italy in the early 1920s. And of course, the fascist movement was very, very interested in having they were reviving ancient Rome and having buildings from ancient Rome that looked like ancient Rome. Now, there's been a large debate that I won't get into about both the ancient and the medieval designations of this structure. Munoz's book, publishing his work, calls it well, in Italian, il restauro del tempio della fortuna virile, manly fortune, shall we say in English. But there were also other possibilities, and that debate is now pretty much over. The weight of scholarly opinion has swung very solidly to the identification of this building, the original identification of this building, as the Temple of Portunus, who was the god of harbors. And it makes sense because it's right beside the harbor of Rome on the Tiber. The medieval designation or dedication of the church has also been much disputed. From the early modern period onwards, it was known as Santa Maria Egyptiaca, Saint Mary the Egyptian, after the repentant Egyptian prostitute whose story circulated widely in the Middle Ages. And this may have derived from scenes of her life, which we'll come to, painted on the walls of the interior. But that name is only attested in documents from the year 1492. So, after the Middle Ages have come and gone. So we'll come back to the question of the dedication, but for the moment, let's look and see what it was that Munoz discovered. So here we're looking at the interior of the church, a diagram on the left that I'll explain in a moment, and you're looking at what is essentially column A on the diagram is shown in the slide on the right, the image on the right. Now, in its complicated history, in 1566, Pope Pius V granted this building, this church, to the Armenian community in Rome. There's a story behind that too, which if we have time later, I'll come back to. And they would remain in possession until 1916. So they would remain for a very long time, 350 years. And when they took possession, almost immediately, they initiated a campaign of renovation, including a complete redecoration of the interior space. And as was often the case in such circumstances, the existing medieval decorations were removed completely, except where they would now be covered and thus completely hidden from view. because there was no point in wasting your time and your resources on removing things that were going to be covered up anyway. Now, these renovations included the installation of 4 interior pilasters running from floor to ceiling, 2 on each wall. You can see them in the diagram A, B, C, D. So you have to imagine these as stucco pilasters that run from floor to ceiling. And when these were removed by Munoz in the early 1920s, he discovered that quite a lot of the original medieval painting survived on the walls beneath. So in the other spaces, they had removed the paintings, but they didn't bother to remove them where they were going to be covered over. The diagram on the left comes from a book by the Belgian art historian Jacqueline Lafontaine, whose 1959 study has been really the most, well, it was the first major study of murals and it remains the most significant. And she identified some 25, you can see them numbered, 25 fragments of the original medieval decoration, mostly belonging to the 4 vertical columns, 2 of which were on each side wall of the church. And there were also a few fragments in the upper regions of the end wall. So you can see those as 23, 24, 25. Now, with only a few exceptions, these were found to be in exceptionally poor condition. And indeed, they have subsequently required conservation on multiple occasions, most recently between 2006 and 2008, in a major campaign sponsored by the World Monuments Fund, to which we are very grateful. Fortunately, enough remains to determine quite a bit about what the original program would have looked like. And we can reconstruct some 6 horizontal registers on the side wall. So it's painted from floor to ceiling. 5 of them, at least with figures. And furthermore, we can determine that all the painting belonged to a single campaign, right? So it's all done at the same time. Now, to summarize just very briefly, what do we have? Well, the top register, and there's an example of the best preserved scene from that here on the left, the top register was devoted to the infancy and life of Mary. So her birth, the story of her parents, Anna and Joachim, her birth, and so on. The second register, and you see an example from that on the right, to the story of her dormition, right? Her falling asleep and subsequent transition into heaven. The third register was devoted in part to the life of the important 4th century theologian from what is today Cappadocia in central Turkey, Saint Basil of Caesarea, and in part to heads of saints set above a marble cornice. And you can see that in the lower part of the image on the right. You can see part of the marble cornice that also survives, and you can see 2 heads of saints in little squares just above it. And we have 4 saints that survive, 2 on each wall, and 2 of them are Eastern saints, Pantaleon, or Pantaleon, whatever you pronounce it, and Tutael. Tutael is an exceptionally obscure Syrian stylite saint. Stylite saints were those who practiced mortification of the flesh by spending their lives at the top of a great column, a great pillar. And he was, I've never encountered him in any other context other than this one. And they're all identified by name. And then 2 Western saints, female saints, Rufina and Prisca, all identified by inscriptions. Moving down, the 4th register, not well preserved, but has additional narratives of saints' lives, of which the one that can be most readily identified depicts the aforementioned Saint Mary the Egyptian, The fifth one, you can see at the bottom of slide on the left, more standing figures of saints. And I'm afraid all trace now is gone. Nothing remains of the decorations in the lowest register, but we generally assume that it would have been decorated with fictive curtains, which was the normal practice in Roman churches in the early Middle Ages. And then on the end wall, which you can see on the right, three fragments remained of a sort of theophanic vision of Christ based on the text of the Apocalypse, the last book of the New Testament. Now, before we can use these documents, I want you to think of them as documents, before we can use them in any significant way, the next question we need to pose as historians is, what's their date, right? Because if we're going to use them as documents, we need to know, are they 5th century? Are they 9th century? Are they 15th century? It makes a difference. We know the church was decorated only once, but the question is when? And here we may have a clear answer, because there was originally a dedication inscription, unfortunately long since lost, but two fragments of it were discovered and were copied about the year 1580 at the time that the interior was renovated, when the Armenians took over the building. And the text of these fragments was recorded for posterity by a number of contemporary and later antiquarian scholars. And the principal one, whose name won't mean anything to you, it means little to me either, Francesco Torriggio, in the year 1635. And the inscription provided, and you see the main bit of it here, the inscription provided the following information. The church was dedicated to Mary, right? You see the Virginis in the first word. It's not Mary the Egyptian now. This is Mary, the mother of Jesus. The donor was a senior papal official named Stephen, assisted in this enterprise by his wife and his children. And most importantly, in the last line, we are told that the reigning pope was John VIII. Praesulus octavi nunc tempore iure Ioannis. And so we can date the dedication, we can date the paintings to his time, 872 to 882. And thus the murals constitute an exceptionally important survival from a moment in Rome's history for which we otherwise have no written records from the city. Now, the medieval dedication has also been the subject of considerable debate, and there's obviously no question that it was a Santa Maria, but later medieval catalogues of Rome's churches identified two churches in this immediate area, both dedicated to Mary. There was Santa Maria de Secundicerio, in other words, of the Secundicerios. Well, what's the Secundicerios? That was the second most important position in the papal administration, as the name implies, right? Our word second comes from the same Latin word. The primary position was the primicarius. The second in command of the papal bureaucracy was the secundicarius. The other possibility was Santa Maria de Gradelis, in other words, of the steps. And there were possible arguments for both. But some years ago, I noted that the secundicarius in the early years of John VIII was actually named Stephen, right? We know that from other documents, from other sources. And this might lend some weight to the first of these possibilities. And if that's true, and I'm pleased to say it's been widely accepted, and no one has argued against me, if it's true, we can narrow down the years of the decoration even more precisely, because Stephen belonged to that Formosan political party named after a member of the Roman nobility by the name of Formosus, Bishop of Porto, who would later become Pope, incidentally. in a much later, in 891, he would become Pope. But in the 870s, he was opposing, his party opposed the papacy of John VIII. And when push came to shove, they decided they better flee Rome for their safety. And as I mentioned, they fled from Rome on the night before Easter Sunday of 876, apparently in their haste, leaving the St. Pancras Gate, the Porta San Pancrazio, open. And thus John VIII complains that they put Rome into a jeopardy. Well, if so, that would narrow down the range of years considerably. We know John VIII was elected in, I think it was 14th of December in 872. And if Stephen Secundicerius is the patron of this campaign of murals, then it can't date after April 876. So we have about three years and a bit in which these paintings were probably done, roughly 873 to 875. And for the early Middle Ages in Rome, that's a pretty exact kind of date. We rarely have anything so precise. Now, apart from the evidence provided by the lost inscription, I think there are at least two other excellent reasons for dating the murals to the 870s. Just realized I'm going to have to speed this up. The first is that this is a moment when there's a documented interest in the lives of a number of Eastern saints, including Basil of Caesarea. We know Basil's life was translated from Greek into Latin by the papal librarian of the day, Anastasius, who claims in his introduction that it is the first such translation into Latin. Anastasius was one of the foremost intellectuals in papal service in the 860s and 870s. He was very fluent in Greek at a time when these skills were becoming less common in Rome, and he is known for his many translations from Greek into Latin, including both saints' lives and the acts of various church councils. And my second reason, and so the life of Basil makes sense, right, at this moment when a new Latin translation has happened. And my second reason stems from the comparison that you see here between the Santa Maria murals on the left, the Annunciation to Mary of her forthcoming death, and on the right, the painting in the lower church, the excavated church beneath San Clemente in Rome, which I believe marks the tomb of the Byzantine missionary to the Slavs, Saint Cyril, who gives his name to the Cyrillic alphabet, who we know died in Rome on the 14th of February in the year 869 and was buried in San Clemente to the right of the altar. I've made the case elsewhere that the mural that you see on the right must have formed part of that funerary monument. We can, that's his portrait in the lower left. He's dressed as a Greek monk. The scene is that of the anastasis or resurrection, a most appropriate subject for a tomb and one often found in funerary contexts. It's located very precisely to the right of the altar, and a contemporary account does specify that Cyril's portrait was painted over the tomb. And so I think a good case can be made, not only that this is the portrait in question, but also that the same workshop of painters was responsible for both murals. And I will draw your attention to just one very specific detail, the very specific geometric designs that we see at San Clemente on Cyril's hood, the hood that identifies him as a monk. So those red designs on either side of his head. And we see the same designs on the border of the mattress in the scene of Christ addressing his mother, announcing her death. And I don't believe these have any intrinsic iconographical meaning other than simply to indicate designs on fabric. And the specific details were left to the invention of the artist. And the fact that they're absolutely identical, I mean, there's some interesting patterns. You can see them best on the right side of Cyril's hood. They're precisely identical. And this suggests to me that the same artist or workshop was responsible for both. Now, the decades after the end of iconoclasm in 843 and the restoration of images in Byzantium constitute a moment of renewed political, cultural, and artistic interaction between Rome and Constantinople. And our sources tell us of frequent exchanges of embassies, at least one of which included a famous Byzantine icon painter, Lazarus. And there was also an exchange of luxury objects, and many of these are recorded in passages in the mid-9th century biographies in the Liber Pontificalis, where we still have those. Most of the interaction between Rome and Constantinople in the mid-9th century involved matters of the church and of church politics. For example, both sides in the ongoing contest between two individuals, Ignatius and Photius, for the Patriarchate of Constantinople, they were both soliciting papal support and frequently sent delegations to try to get the Pope on their side. There was also the really thorny issue of whether the Pope or the Patriarch would have jurisdiction over the newly converted areas of the Balkans and Central Europe, to which both the Latin and Greek churches had been sending missionaries. The popes, and especially Nicholas I, 858 to 867, took the view that the Roman Church had ultimate authority in all such matters and not Constantinople. And for some time, that view actually seemed to prevail and was even accepted at a council in Constantinople in 869. But what eventually tipped the balance against the Roman Church was the political situation. So as I mentioned earlier, Italy was once again under attack, now from Sicily and from North Africa. And of course, in 846, Rome experienced the dramatic sack of St. Peter's. The Carolingian rulers, and especially the Emperor Louis II, great-grandson of Charlemagne, who ruled as sole emperor from 855, Western emperor from 855 to 875, he attempted to defend southern Italy, and he did achieve some success. But resistance to the Saracens crumbled after his death, and that led to the threat of new attacks on Rome and the capture and sack of the major central Italian monasteries previously mentioned. The Franks seemed unable to come to papal assistance, and in desperation, Pope John VIII turned again to Byzantium and to the new and very powerful emperor in Byzantium, Basil I, who did agree on conditions to defend Rome and who actually sent a fleet to defend the mouth of the Tiber and scored a huge victory in the summer of the year 880. And we do have the text of the Pope's letter to Basil, dated 13th of August, 880, which records his profuse gratitude. Of course, there was a political price to pay. The emperor had his own candidate for Patriarch of Constantinople. John had to give in, and he also had to renounce any jurisdiction over the Bulgarian and other Slavic churches. The paintings in Santa Maria de Secundicerio, I think, should be viewed in this political and cultural context. As we have seen, the subject matter reveals strong ties to the Eastern Mediterranean, the saints, the church fathers of the East, and so on, reflecting the culture of the papal court in the decade of the 870s. And the same is also true for other aspects of the decoration. And perhaps the most intriguing aspect of these murals is, in fact, the decoration of the borders. The design, as you can see here, is formed by bands of pearls, painted little white dots, which form linked circles or squares of alternating size. On the left, you can see the alternating size. And the larger ones enclose additional motifs, a series of male heads depicted either frontally or in three-quarter view, alternating with a series of rosette patterns. And to the best of my knowledge, this has no exact parallel anywhere in early medieval Rome. This is another church from Rome, Santa Maria Antiqua, the left aisle, and you can see the borders between scenes are just left plain, they're empty. And that was the normal situation in Rome. But figures in borders and medallions is something that we do know from early Christian art, and it's something that survived in Byzantine art. Some early Christian examples here, tapestry in Cleveland on the right, the Brescia ivory casket on the upper left, and below left the apse of Monster St. Catherine at Mount Sinai. So this concept of medallion images and borders with medallions is really quite ubiquitous in the early Christian and Byzantine world, and it suddenly revived in Rome in the 9th century. And I think that requires some comment. And indeed, Jacqueline Lafontaine and others have pointed out that a really good parallel is to be found in the contemporary 10th century churches in Cappadocia, in central Turkey, and it's Gurame Chapel 1 that you see on the right. The heads in our Roman church are also very strange. We would normally expect them to represent saints or apostles. They don't seem to, none of them are labeled. They seem to be rather odd, almost as if the artist had no specific model or subject in mind, but knew he was supposed, or was told that they wanted a border with heads and medallions, and he was again left to his own devices. The links to the post-iconoclastic arts of Byzantium are not limited to border designs. Indeed, many observers have been struck by the similarity of the twisted ribbon design in the arch that frames the scene of Basil and the repentant sinner from Santa Maria de Secundicerio here on the left, to a very similar doorway framing the standing figure of the iconophile champion John of Damascus in the 9th century manuscript known as the Sacra Parallela, now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, Greek 923, folio 208 recto. The style of the miniatures in this manuscript, and particularly what Kurt Weitzman has identified as a double line fold style, a sort of shorthand to identify drapery folds, which we can see on the thigh of Basil in the image on the left, and which we can see throughout. Here's some good examples in the sort of central column from Paris Greek 923. On the right from San Clemente, the image of Pope Leo IV from earlier in the century. This style seems to pervade not only Roman painting, but Byzantine art in the 9th century. And in fact, it's led to quite a controversy about where Paris Greek 923 was actually written. And Kurt Weitzman has argued for Palestine, but André Grabar has has argued for Rome, precisely on the basis of the comparison to the murals in Santa Maria de Secundicerio. And while I won't get into that issue, which would take a much longer talk, whoops, oh dear, didn't mean to do that. Oh, goodness. All right, well, we'll leave it there. I'll just finish with two observations. The first is that Paris 923 is most unlikely to have been written in Rome. I think there is simply no viable patron for it. There's no viable context for its production. It's a very deluxe manuscript. It's not one made for regular or daily use, and the extensive use of gold leaf suggests that it was commissioned for an important and wealthy patron, or else as a gift for one. And the use of the Greek language employed indicates that that person must have been from a Greek-speaking environment. And there's simply, there's no evidence of any kind that anyone in Rome could have been the patron. There's no viable candidates for a patron in Rome at this time. In fact, the most recent study of the manuscript by Jose Leclerc makes a compelling case that the The intended patron was the Emperor of Byzantium, Basil I himself. The second and last observation, with which I'll finish, is that for the purposes of analyzing the fragmentary paintings in Santa Maria de Secundicerio, it doesn't really matter, I think, where the Sacra Parallela manuscript was actually written. What it demonstrates is that the murals in this church belong to the context of Mediterranean Byzantine art and really have nothing in common with contemporary painting elsewhere in Western Europe. They speak eloquently to the renewal of cultural, artistic, and political links between Rome and Constantinople in the third quarter of the 9th century, reflecting the politics of that age. So finally, this brief introduction to the Church of Santa Maria de Secundicerio has had two intentions. The first is to convince you of the value of even tiny fragments of painting as historical documents, regardless of the quality of the execution or their fragmentary condition. As historians, we must employ all the evidence at our disposal, and not only works of high quality or of excellent preservation. And the second is the necessity of interpreting works of art in their cultural context. Taken on their own, these murals may not seem all that interesting, but when we consider the subject matter and the style, suddenly the decorations of the Secundicerius Stephanus become much more significant as documents and hence worthy of our attention. And I'll leave it on that image and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate that, and certainly you're drawing our attention to a part of the story that many of us are unfamiliar with. And so, in that, it's always a really interesting and valuable contribution to kind of hear these other voices from the past, elucidating to connections that we might not otherwise be very familiar with. Now we have some time if there are any sort of questions or comments. We will open it up that you can feel free to raise your hand, or the chat function is disabled, but if you do want to type a question, one of either myself or one of our hosts would be happy to ask it of our speaker.
I'm sorry that my mouse seemed to have a life of its own there at the end and was running around.
Oh, that's okay. I have a question here from Jim. I think we sent you an unmute there.
Thank you very much for a fascinating paper, John, as always. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yes.
Okay. One thing you didn't talk about, but which really caught my eye, was the density of the cycles dedicated to Mary.
Yes.
And I'm not aware of, I mean, it's not my area, but I'm not aware of other such detailed cycles of Mary's early life, particularly at this time.
No, it's very, very rare. In fact, until quite recently, this was thought to be the first one in existence anywhere. Now we have some evidence that about a century earlier, in a church in the Roman Forum, there was also a cycle dedicated to Mary's infancy. Of course, the Proto-Evangelium of James goes back to the 2nd century, so we have written accounts, but this is the first sort of substantial evidence for it in the visual arts. Yeah, anywhere.
Wonderful.
So very important building from that perspective.
Thank you.
Yeah, really fascinating in that way, the images. I'm wondering, you were speaking a little bit to the prevalence of this material in papal courts, and I'm wondering, would this be something that, we have these intersections of different cultural practices. Would this be something, and I suppose we don't really know in terms of who was designing, but importing artisans perhaps from the East, or something that was being produced by Romans in the Eastern style?
Yes, and I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, part of the problem is we don't have a lot of comparative material either in Rome nor in Byzantium. If it had been a century later, yes, we would have a lot more. from the late 9th century. There are some mosaics in Saint Sophia, presumably no longer accessible at the moment, since it's been now reconverted into a mosque. But there's just very little in the way of comparanda, which is why I'm quite excited by the fact that it seems to be the same workshop that was painted the tomb of Cyril in San Clemente. But yes, we do know, I mean, we have evidence that the diplomatic exchanges included artists. Specifically, we're told about Lazarus, the icon painter. There may well have been mural painters as well. But if you compare this painting to, we have a few examples of painting north of the Alps from this period, in Trier and in Auxerre in France, and they're not anything like it. And we're also getting more and more technical evidence from pigment analysis and so on that shows that really there's a sort of Mediterranean painterly tradition that continues long after the politics. I mean, if you ask political historians, they'll tell you, oh no, there's a huge rupture, when Charlemagne gets crowned emperor and so on. Culturally, that just doesn't happen, right? There is no rupture.
Yeah, and not a firm break either, right? This is a more nuanced interpretation of really these dialogues going on and continuing between East and West.
What I really get annoyed about is how people spin history, and how many historical books will ever tell you that it was the Byzantine fleet that saved Rome in the summer of 880.
Yeah, you're entirely right. I'm pretty sure the ones we're using do not.
Yeah. So it's and when you take that into account, then there's all kinds of interesting tidbits. So I showed you the image of Leo IV, whose lovely portrait is in San Clemente, 847 to 855. In his biography in the Liber Pontificalis, there's actually mention of a papal official who's the commander of the papal forces, military, and he's charged with possibly engineering a coup to bring back the Byzantine connection. And I mean, he's put on trial for that. So he's eventually let off. But the fact that he was arrested and put on trial for trying to, ditch the Franks and let's bring back the Emperor of Constantinople is an interesting little tidbit.
Now, what happens as well with the murder of Pope John VIII?
There's only one. I think it's the Annales Fuldenses that mentions it, and it's interesting. They say that it was an attempt to poison him, and it didn't work quickly enough, so they beat him to death with a hammer.
Oh,
but it was a violent age. It was a very violent age, and he was not the only pope in the last years of the 9th century who met a sorry end. It's not the best moment in the history of the Roman Church.
I think we have another question here from my colleague, Dr. McLeod.
Yes, it's a fantastic talk. Thank you very much. It was wonderful.
I'm wondering, I'm really interested. I mean, I'm a historian of a 16th, 17th century, but I'm always interested in this expansion of where we get our material, of course, and like the larger material culture. So beyond these images, right, like you talk about the icons or the images that you're showing here from the chapel, like, does that work ever, or does this kind of material ever kind of work in kind of concert with other material culture that isn't like painting? I'm talking about like just objects that you might find in like an archaeological dig or something like that.
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. Yeah. So, we have all kinds of evidence. We have evidence on the walls of buildings that we find in restorations, and mostly that's where, our major evidence comes from. We have some objects, we have manuscripts, we have carved ivories, we have carved marble, we have all kinds of different kinds of evidence. Until fairly recently, archaeology in Rome itself really focused on the ancient world. And in fact, another church I've worked on, Santa Maria Antiqua, when it was excavated in 1900, they used dynamite to try to blow away the medieval stuff to get down to the important things, right, underneath. Dynamite had just been invented by Mr. Nobel in 1900. So, but they don't do that anymore, fortunately. And so now we have a lot of ceramic evidence, we have glass, we have all kinds of stuff from early medieval Rome. There's been huge advances in the knowledge that we have, which is one of the reasons I want to do this set of books. For example, we know that the Roman Forum was planted in the Middle Ages with vegetable gardens and so on. And paleobotanists can look at the seeds and spores and tell us exactly what was, here there was a row of lettuce, and here there was a row of something else. It's extraordinary, the wealth of information that is coming to light in recent years through archaeology. And there also have been, this was a discovery of 1921, but there have been a number of major discoveries in Rome in recent years, and particularly for the later Middle Ages, not so much for this period. So there's new stuff coming. That's what makes it exciting, because there's new stuff coming to light all the time.
Well, if there are no other questions or comments, please don't be shy, students. This is your chance. If I don't see any other hands up, or I don't see any comments coming through there, maybe from my
okay, well, let me just maybe finish with to try to a comment reinforcing. I mean, the one thing I would love people to take away from this, students of history and students of Middle Ages, students of church history, is that we tend to rely entirely on the Petrologia Latina and other sources as our historical documents. Don't forget that there's a wealth of other kinds of documentation that can supplement, can correct, can help us to get a better understanding of what was going on in the period. And I think without these images, and without the manuscripts that people can't decide whether they're written in Rome or my own view of that manuscript is it's written in Constantinople, and I think I could give an entire lecture on why I think that. But I'm very convinced. But these debates go on. But without the evidence of material culture, the little snippets of written evidence that we have, such as the Byzantine fleet was protecting Rome in 80 AD, such as the papal official was on trial because he wanted to bring back the imperial rule from Constantinople. Those things, they don't have a context, but with things like this, they help provide that context.
Well said, Professor Osborne. Okay, well, please join me virtually or otherwise with some applause to thank Professor Osborne for his perspective today. I don't think you can hear everyone else, but certainly I'll applaud for them at my end. So thank you so much for joining us today virtually to present on Pope John VIII and this amazing Byzantine connection elucidated through these fragments within Santa Maria Secundicerio in Rome, but also with the Greek manuscript you mentioned as well in the Paris National Library. Dr. McLeod, did you want to say something about the next paper for? No. Okay.
Sure. Next one, I don't have the exact date, but I think it's October 27th, just in time for Halloween. Scottish witches. So we'll be ready for them, not the witches themselves, but the talk about the witches in late October. So information will be circulated. And thank you again to Dr. Osborne. Fantastic.
Been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.